Welcome back to the Deep Dive. This is where we take the sources you provide us, the articles, the history texts, the research papers, and turn that stack into a focused, thorough, and hopefully surprising shortcut to knowledge. Today, we have a remarkable blend in front of us. It's a geographical and chronological grab bag that, at first glance, seems utterly random. We're going to conduct a deep dive into three highly specific and seemingly unrelated historical moments. First, we're heading to the frozen north to ask a really fundamental question about the Viking Age. Why did a culture whose highest virtue was, courting death, a culture that routinely conquered heavily fortified cities, why did they actively avoid one particular tribe, the Sami, treating their territory with just extreme caution? Then second, we pivot entirely. We're going to take to Japan and the megacity of Edo, which is modern Tokyo. How did a city that was constantly rebuilding itself from fire, a city where really centralized planning dictated every building and every action, how did it manage to feed its massive population, often after dark, through this chaotic, decentralized network of street food?
A network that became both a social leveler and an essential safety mechanism. And finally, we're traveling back to Roman Britain. We're going to step inside a smoky, cramped Londinium house. We'll use that environment to contrast it sharply with the Icenian culture of East Anglia and reveal how that very specific upbringing prepared a woman named Boudica not just for leadership, but for a devastating rebellion that shook the Roman world to its absolute core. It's a lot of ground to cover. I mean, we're spanning thousands of miles and centuries, but there really is a profound connection running through all of it.
Exactly. Our mission today is to extract the underlying lessons about adaptability and really the power of local knowledge when it's facing overwhelming centralized power. You have these massive, seemingly invincible entities, the Viking machine, the disciplined shogunate bureaucracy of Edo, the Roman Empire. And in each case, the sources reveal these quiet points of failure.
The moment it all just falls apart for them.
Yes, the moment when their usual advantages suddenly evaporate. The thread connecting these sources is recognizing that brute force, complex systems, or military might, they are not universally applicable solutions. They fail against environmental influence, against superior local logistics, and against a deep-rooted cultural identity.
So we're looking for the moment when caution or efficiency or resistance proves more powerful than outright conquest.
Precisely.
Okay, let's unpack this. We'll start with a culture that, as you said, built its identity on the idea that hesitation was a personal flaw, the Vikings. When you look at the sagas, the rich history and storytelling of the Norse, whether we're talking about the family histories of the Icelandic sagas or the power chronicles of the King sagas, the Viking worldview is established so early and maintained so fiercely. They truly believed that dying dramatically in battle was a professional achievement.
That is the ultimate contrast you have to understand to appreciate their fear of the Sami. For the Norse, the concept of hell, and we're not talking about the flaming Christian hell, but the cold, bleak underworld where the dishonorable dead went, that was the worst possible outcome.
But that's where you went if you died in bed.
Right, if you died quietly, of old age or sickness.
Right.
It was the ultimate career-ending embarrassment. Valhalla was reserved exclusively for those who died with a weapon in their hand. It was the whole point.
So they saw fear as something strictly for the weak, or the uneducated. They sailed into storms that were actively trying to sink them. They mocked kings to their faces. They treated heavily fortified cities like, what did the source say? Mildly inconvenient speed bumps.
Yeah, and defeat was never honestly attributed to the enemy's skill. It was always bad luck, fate, or most commonly trickery. It was never a fair fight that they lost.
That cultural confidence is everything, isn't it? Their entire society ran on this kind of kinetic energy.
It did. Their solutions were always loud, aggressive, and physical. So when the sagas, which are written specifically to celebrate boldness, suddenly change their tone, you absolutely have to pay attention. The sources describe this rare, almost uncomfortable silence.
Let me talk about the North.
When they talk about the northern lands and the people we now know as the Samio, yes, the bragging just stops. The language becomes almost deliberately vague, and the locations are mentioned briefly, often just avoided. It's like, to quote our sources, like someone accidentally bringing up an awkward family secret at dinner.
Silence in a Viking story is absolutely screaming. That's what you're saying. It signals a profound psychological roadblock.
It does. They weren't afraid of death. They were running toward it, hoping to secure their bragging rights for the afterlife. What they feared was unpredictability, and more importantly, inefficiency.
Inefficiency, that's interesting.
They were businessmen of violence in a way. They were accustomed to battle being an immediate brutal transaction. They wanted enemies who would stand still long enough to be struck. The Sami simply refused to comply with the rules of Viking warfare.
So the conflict they encountered wasn't a proper battle in the Viking sense at all. It was something else, something deeply unsettling.
It was psychological warfare executed through environmental mastery. I mean, imagine you land your ships, your longship, which is your pride and joy, and you march inland with your best warriors. You're in completely unfamiliar territory. The terrain is nothing like the coasts or the flatlands of England they usually raided, and you immediately feel watched.
But you see nothing.
You see no scouts, no villagers, no fortifications, absolutely nothing. Then suddenly, an arrow arrives without warning, maybe from 100 yards away, through dense trees, and the shooter is gone before you can even locate the source.
They weren't fighting people. They were fighting ghosts.
Precisely. They disliked conflicts that refused to happen properly. The Vikings' entire strategy revolved around shock and overwhelming force, but here, the shock was silent and their force was totally irrelevant. The men felt less like conquering warriors and more like they were being slowly, methodically bullied by the geography itself.
And this failure to engage on terms they understood. They would have seen that as
Cheating. It felt like cheating.
right. And the land itself conspired against them because their greatest assets, the things that made them Vikings, became immediate liabilities.
This is such a crucial point about tactical failure. Viking armies relied on heavy, high-quality gear. We're talking mail shirts, heavy iron helmets, large, round wooden shields. On open, contested ground, like in a shield wall formation, this gear offered a significant advantage.
But not in a dense forest.
But when visibility drops, when movement is slowed by dense, unforgiving Krumholtz forests, and sound behaves strangely because of a thick snowpack, all that heavy equipment becomes a profound, exhausting liability.
The sources suggest that their armor, which usually represented strength and status, suddenly just turned into a crippling weight.
It did. It slowed them down, making them easier targets for silent, unseen attacks from a distance. A spear, which is designed to be thrown or held in a shield wall, constantly snagged on low-hanging branches. An axe, their iconic weapon, requires space to swing that they just couldn't find.
So they transformed. From fearless conquerors to what?
To sweating, disoriented, and deeply suspicious people who very quickly realized that the problem was one they could not punch into submission. Their very confidence was weaponized against them by the environment.
And the Sami territory itself was, it was beyond the psychological edge of the map for the Norse. The tundra and these dense northern forests are inconveniently placed, to put it mildly.
And this environment offered no fixed targets. You have to think about what a Viking raid relies on. Fixed wealth. It relies on towns, stored grain, livestock gathered in pens, fortifications that contain treasure, and a populace that will panic and surrender.
And the Sami offered none of that.
None of it. Their wealth was fluid. It was often based on semi-domesticated reindeer herds, which could be moved. It was based on knowledge of hunting trails and routes that could be gathered. Their entire lifestyle was mobile.
So if a Viking party marched all day, they might find, what? An empty campsite.
Nothing but snow, empty campsites, and the growing, deeply uncomfortable suspicion that they were the ones who were lost. They were the ones being hunted.
Utterly frustrating. The concept of raiding depended on a fixed reward structure. If you cannot find the people, or the people have already packed up their living wealth and moved on, the effort is just wasted.
Completely wasted. And this environmental failure was then amplified by their navigation difficulties.
How did the environment specifically break their navigation skills?
Because they were master sailors. They were. For a maritime culture like the Vikings, their greatest pride was their naval skill. They could navigate by the stars, the sun, the sea currents, the flight of birds. But inland, in the far north, the conditions were completely different. Landmarks just vanished under deep snow. The light was flat, often a featureless gray, making direction and depth perception almost impossible.
And the ground itself is treacherous.
The ground was often covered in snow that looked solid until it betrayed you, forcing a painful, slow detour. Their sophisticated naval knowledge was totally useless. Land navigation became this terrifying ordeal where it felt like nature itself was quietly laughing at them.
Which takes us neatly to the concept of magic. If their superior technology, their armor, their weapons, and their superior skill navigation, combat training, if all of that failed, they needed an explanation.
Of course. And the sources repeatedly, consistently described the Sami as sorcerers, as shapeshifters, and as masters of the weather.
To us, today, this is a clear rationalization for tactical failure.
Of course. But to the Vikings, who lived in a world where belief and reality were intimately linked, where magic was a recognized, if dangerous, force, it was a perfectly reasonable explanation for things that refused to behave properly.
So it's not just an excuse, it's how they genuinely interpreted the world.
I think so. Think about the practical effects. If a sudden, localized snowstorm appears inland, timed perfectly to ruin your march or to extinguish a crucial campfire, and you know these local people are described as weather makers, it ceases to be bad luck. It starts to feel personal, it feels targeted.
You can't fight a snowstorm.
Right. You cannot stab fog, you cannot duel confusion, and you certainly cannot shout your way out of being lost. Their attacks were directed at the Vikings' cognitive understanding of the world, not just their bodies. And that is far, far more terrifying.
But the real aha moment, the thing that connects all these disparate parts, the fear of the Sami and the Viking belief system, is the explicit connection to their most powerful deity.
The Odin connection is the ultimate stamp of approval on Sami power. You have Odin, the Allfather. He's the god of war, wisdom, and crucially, runic magic and poetry. He is famously pragmatic. He is willing to suffer any indignity, hanging himself on Yggdrasil for 9 nights, sacrificing an eye if it meant gaining essential hidden knowledge.
And what do the Norse myths say about where Odin sought his knowledge? Not from other gods, necessarily.
No. Norse myths clearly describe Odin traveling in disguise, often seeking knowledge and wisdom from northern shamans, the Noeti, who strongly resemble the Sami. They are masters of transvision, shapeshifting, and this hidden, dangerous knowledge that transcended normal human understanding.
So the message is undeniable to any Viking listening to these stories. If the very god of war treats these people not as a target to be crushed, but as a teacher to be respected,
Then you do not charge in yelling. You hesitate, you withdraw, you show respect.
it was a pragmatic retreat then, disguised as deep caution and respect.
I think that's the best way to put it. The Sami refused to be intimidated. They simply faded into the landscape, returning when the invaders were gone. They didn't covet the coastal settlements or the farmlands, which was deeply confusing behavior to a conquering culture. They just wanted to be left alone.
So the final calculation then was pure, cold Viking efficiency. Raiding the Sami was consistently disappointing and utterly unrewarding.
Exactly. It guaranteed frostbite, exhaustion, confusion, and the high probability of losing good men to invisible enemies or geographical traps. It offered no significant loot, no valuable stories to tell back home, only the shame of having wasted effort.
And for a Viking, wasting effort was almost as bad as cowardice.
It was. The Vikings, who were master logisticians of plunder, quietly adjusted their routes. Fear, in this context, was simply a highly sensible warning. Stay away from the place where your standard tools don't work.
That is the ultimate Viking lesson. Bravery without reward is pointless. And that brings us, quite sharply, from a culture avoiding inefficiency in the far north to a massive, complicated city where hyper-efficiency and logistics were everything Edo and its nightly, fire-defying transformation. Okay, so we transition now from the snowy, decentralized territories of the Sami to one of the largest, most densely populated cities on Earth in the 18th century. When the sun dipped behind Edo's rooftops, the city didn't just wind down. Our sources say it sharpened its collective appetite and became this moving, temporary kitchen.
The atmosphere you describe is crucial. This transformation was driven entirely by the central, critical factor of fire. Edo, modern Tokyo, was enormous. We're talking over 1 million people, and it was constructed almost entirely of wood and paper. Consequently, the city was perpetually, absolutely terrified of catastrophic conflagration.
I recall the sources describing entire districts just being wiped out almost annually. It was a fact of life.
Exactly. The sheer density and the lack of modern firefighting meant that laws regulating cooking, heating, and open flames were incredibly strict. These laws applied most aggressively to individual homes, particularly in the cramped, multifamily tenements where a single cooking accident could doom the entire block in minutes.
So street food was born out of pure necessity, not just convenience. It was often safer than cooking indoors.
It was a perfect bending of the law. Since home cooking faced severe restrictions, limited hours, specific types of contained hearths, the centralized bureaucracy of the shogunate tolerated this decentralized street food network because it solved a massive public safety and logistical problem. The food was cooked quickly, in small, specialized environments, the yatai and consumed immediately, which removed the fire hazard from the packed residential areas.
The atmosphere sounds electric, though. I mean, paper lanterns, the smell of charcoal, the packed dirt roads slicked with rain. It must have been a true sensory experience.
Oh, absolutely. The vendors, or yaremis, were masters of efficiency. They didn't just appear, they were summoned by hunger and routine. They'd set up strategically near bridge approaches, the lively theater districts, and the ferry landings, anywhere that high traffic naturally forced people to slow down for a moment.
And the food itself was designed for that environment.
Completely designed for speed, for warmth, for immediate satisfaction. You stood, you ate, you handed the bowl back, and you moved on. There was no ceremony, because in a city that dense, space was the ultimate currency. There was no time or room for lingering.
This brings us to the fascinating social element, the unifying force of food, this sort of social flattening that happened at the night market.
It was a critical, controlled contradiction within a highly hierarchical society. Edo society was rigid. You had the samurai at the top, followed by farmers, artisans, and then merchants at the bottom. But at the night market, that rank softened considerably.
You mean that the samurai were breaking their own rules?
Yes. They absolutely were, or at least bending them dramatically. A samurai was required to maintain dignity and restraint, and often ate a highly controlled, simple diet. But our sources are full of descriptions of them sneaking bowls of noodles in alleyways, swords resting against the wall, paying the exact same price as a common laborer.
Because at that moment, they were just another hungry person.
Exactly. When everyone was, as one source put it, equally wet, equally hungry, and equally impatient, the titles and the social distance just faded temporarily. The only etiquette that truly mattered was efficiency. Don't stare, don't complain, eat quickly, and make room for the next person.
So the chaos was contained. It was predictable because everyone understood the shared goal.
Hot food, fast. This brief, temporary social equality was tolerated by the authorities because it never challenged the rigid daytime structure. It was a release valve.
Let's delve deeper into this menu of survival, because each item tells a story about Edo life. Let's start with soba, the audible dinner.
Soba vendors were the nomadic backbone of the entire system. Their calls were the soundtrack of the Edo night. The unique feature was their mobility and their announcement. A long, drawn-out, polite shout, often accompanied by the specific sound of the churamella, which is a small horn. This announced that dinner was here, cutting through the thick city noise and the rain.
And they carry their entire kitchen on a shoulder pole, the tenbin. That just speaks volumes about the level of portability required.
It was a marvel of minimalist engineering. One box held the dry noodles, the cooked broth, and the clean bowls. The other end held the small, perfectly contained charcoal stove. And charcoal was key. It burns hot, cleanly, and predictably. It minimizes smoke and spark compared to an open wood fire.
So the vendor could be set up and serving in minutes.
Stop, boil water, assemble a bowl, serve, and pack up in just a few minutes. It was incredible.
And the food itself, these thin, slightly coarse noodles and a simple broth, was truly survival food for the city's tireless workforce.
Essential. It was fast, it was cheap, and it was filling. Soba was the fuel for couriers, messengers, and laborers running shifts through the night. And the famous slurping was actually practical. It cooled the hot noodles while pulling them quickly into the mouth, maximizing speed.
So the whole transaction was designed to leave no trace.
Except warmth in the customer's stomach. Soba vendors literally stitched the night city together, connecting these far-flung districts and keeping the essential machinery of Edo running.
Now let's talk about unagi eel. This sounds like the first hint of luxury in this high-speed functional routine.
Unagi represents a calculated, highly desired indulgence. The moment the scent of eel sweet, fatty, rich hit the hot charcoal, it cut through the smell of damp earth and smoke and announced its presence. Unagi vendors often required slightly more fixed stalls, or at least a more elaborate setup, because the process actually takes time. Live eels were cleaned, skewered, and then glazed repeatedly over the charcoal.
It was an indulgence because of the taste, but also because of the belief in its nutritional value, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The consumption of eel, particularly in the hot, humid Edo summers, was believed to be strengthening a necessary energy boost to combat the brutal heat and fatigue. So while it was a luxury item compared to simple soba, it was justified as a vital, functional food.
A practical luxury.
Yes, and unlike the hurried slipping of noodles, eaten unagi invited a slight slowdown. You stood longer, savoring the smoke and the rich glaze on the skewer. It offered a small, accessible moment of pleasure in an otherwise rigidly controlled environment.
Moving away from the heat and fat, we find dango and other sweets, which offered a moment of true comfort.
Dango stalls were the gentlest part of the night market. They often used smaller, very contained charcoal heaters, focusing on subtle warmth rather than rapid cooking. Dango, those warm, chewy rice dumplings brushed with a sweet glaze, offered comfort for fatigue, cold, or just simple habit.
Given the cost of sugar and rice, these weren't simple impulse buys, were they?
No, they were valued highly. They didn't demand urgency. You could stand a little longer, chew slowly, and the lack of grease made them feel clean and neat, a welcome contrast to the messy, hurried eating of other items. In a city built on discipline, sweets offered a necessary small reward, a temporary softening of the routine.
A small kindness.
Offering a dumpling was a small kindness, yes.
And finally, we have fish cakes and fried foods, pure fuel and efficiency.
This was the ultimate grab-and-go food, ideal for people who literally had to keep moving. Messengers, boatmen, night watchmen. Vendors would set up near the waterways and ferry landings, taking pounded whitefish, shaping it into firm, dense cakes, which were then skewered or sliced.
They didn't promise comfort or luxury, just reliable energy.
High-density calories that could be consumed cleanly and quickly without demanding a halt. What's fascinating is that unlike the nomadic soba vendors, the fish cake sellers often established these semi-permanent points of business. They became neighborhood landmarks.
So they helped map the city.
In a way, yes. The phrase "near the fish cake man by the bridge" became a common, reliable location marker in a city that was otherwise chaotic at night. This food, in a sense, helped map the city's nocturnal flow as much as the fixed streets did.
Let's pull back and look at the logistics of compliance. You mentioned that the market survived not by defying the law, but by bending it. How specific were the fire control measures in the design of the Yatai?
The design was critical. Everything was engineered for rapid breakdown. The use of charcoal over open wood fire was the single biggest control measure. It minimized spark risk and produced less volatile smoke. The stalls themselves were typically light wooden frames covered in cloth or paper, designed to fold or pack onto the 10-bin shoulder pole immediately.
So an official could come by.
An official, a town magistrate, or a fire warden could walk by, and with a single command, the fire could be covered with a tight-fitting lid or doused with water already stored nearby, and the entire operation would vanish in under a minute.
It left no scars.
The efficiency of this routine meant the system left no scars on the rigid daytime order. Ito tolerated the food because it solved the fire risk of home cooking while supporting the economy, without ever fundamentally challenging the shogunate's control.
The city was rigid by day and incredibly flexible by night, managing chaos through efficient, decentralized routine. And that flexibility kept 1 million people fed. From the organized chaos of Ito's disciplined night, let's pivot entirely to the brutal rigidity of Roman Britain and the life that defined a legendary challenger. We're going to start by walking right into a house in Roman Londinium.
Stepping into a Roman Londinium house, and we're talking about the mid-1st century here, right before Boudica's rebellion, is an immediate sensory shock. It's the noise, the dampness, the constant hammering from construction and workshops, and most distinctively, the smell of smoke and oil.
The city is right there with you constantly. Our sources note these houses were narrow, practical rectangles, often timber-framed, sitting right up against the street. The front room almost invariably doubled as a shop, a workshop, or a reception area. Privacy was not a luxury, it was a non-existent concept.
Yet, despite the cold, the damp, and the noise, these houses were intended to be a determined, if desperate, statement of Roman identity. The occupants were insisting on Roman values, even when those values were fundamentally at odds with the cold, wet reality of Britain.
Let's discuss that visual eye, the paintwork. They couldn't afford marble, but they insisted on looking like they could.
Absolutely. The walls were plastered and then painted using vibrant reds, yellows, and occasionally greens pigments that were expensive to import. They employed a technique called trompe-l'oeil, painting these illusionary panels and architectural features to imitate expensive marble slabs or finely cut stone blocks.
This wasn't just decoration, it was propaganda.
It was. Even in a modest home, those designs connected Londinium back to the Mediterranean world. It announced status, connection, and permanence. It declared that Rome had arrived and Roman order would be established, even if that order was mostly a painted illusion on a damp wall.
And the floors contributed to that sense of imposed order as well.
Yes, floors were crucial. You might see simple mosaic or patterned tile, or sometimes a durable cement known as opus signum. They were durable, easy to sweep, and they created a clear separation between the civilized Roman space and the mud and rain outside. They dictated a certain way of living, cleanliness, and order, even in the face of the British climate.
But despite all these attempts at Mediterranean elegance, The climate and the infrastructure limitations meant that smoke ultimately won the battle for the domestic space.
Smoke was the permanent, unavoidable occupant. They lacked chimneys and effective ventilation systems, so cooking fires, small braziers used for heat, and critically, oil lamps burned constantly. These lamps relied on imported olive oil, which was a true luxury, but they were essential for visibility after dark.
So the result was rooms filled with this permanent haze, requiring constant maintenance and, well, breathing in soot.
The air was never clean. Comfort was measured not by the purity of the environment, but by whether the fire stayed lit and the room stayed warm enough to be bearable. Londinium life meant constantly fighting the environment, forcing a high-maintenance imported culture onto a hostile landscape.
And the lack of privacy, which we touched on in Edo, becomes even more striking in Roman Londinium when we consider personal hygiene. The communal latrine system is a detail that always sticks with a learner.
Roman hygiene was a collective, unapologetically public affair, a stark contrast to modern sensibilities. Most Londinium homes did not have internal plumbing or toilets. Residents relied on shared public latrines. These were long stone benches with openings carved along the top, usually positioned above a continuous flow of water or some kind of drainage channel.
And no partitions.
Zero partitions. Privacy was non-existent. You sat beside whoever arrived at the same time, conducted your business, and carried on a conversation as normal. This was the highly socialized Roman approach to the most basic human function.
And the stark reality of their cleaning practices further underscores this communal existence.
Right. Toilet paper did not exist. Instead, the infamous shared sponge on a stick, the tricorium, was the standard practice. It would be rinsed in the flowing water channel and then used by the next person.
Which is something to think about.
It is. This highly intimate, often foul system of shared hygiene was accepted without comment because in the dense reality of Londinium, efficiency and communal convenience outweighed personal comfort or privacy. The Londinium house ultimately was a decoration. Rome imposes its order, even if it means living cramped, smoky, and communal lives.
Now, let's sharply contrast this structured, cramped Roman life with the Icenian world that Boudica grew up in, because that contrast is the entire foundation for her eventual political and military action.
The Icenian world, centered in what is now East Anglia, was defined by the open air, the communal smoky roundhouses, and the rhythm of pastoral wealth. They occupied a territory known for its livestock. Wealth was literal and living. It was measured in cattle, sheep, and horses, not in abstract Roman coins.
And living wealth is vulnerable.
It's vulnerable, but it also creates a tangible, immediate social contract based on shared defense. Everyone understands what needs protecting.
And the education she received was communal and primarily oral, cementing cultural identity through memory and tradition.
Learning happened everywhere. Elders were central. They would recite lineage, ancestral lands, and critically, the historical wrongs suffered by the tribe. These weren't just bedtime stories, they were essential instruction. They defined who owed loyalty to whom and established the limits of external interference. This oral history prepared every child, including Boudica, for their role in defending the collective memory.
And the role of women in the Iceni tribe is perhaps the sharpest contrast to the Roman patriarchal structure.
Absolutely crucial. Unlike the Roman expectation that women be largely relegated to domestic and subservient roles, even if they held some legal rights, Icenian culture allowed women a visible public role in property ownership, ritual, and potentially military authority. Our sources confirm that stories of warrior women, wise negotiators, and fierce protectors were common. Strength in women was expected, not discouraged or suppressed.
So when Boudica later took command, she wasn't defying her culture.
She was stepping into a recognized, if rare, tradition that she had observed and absorbed since childhood. She was fulfilling a cultural archetype.
The pressure point, of course, was the Roman influence that crept inward, creating immediate and, well, confusing tension between the two systems of value.
The cultures valued totally different things. The Romans brought their currency, their taxation systems, their abstract legal concepts. To the Iceni, Roman money was baffling. It couldn't feed a family or be multiplied through breeding. You cannot milk a coin.
And the specific political arrangement that allowed Boudica and her husband Prasudicus to rule was inherently conditional, wasn't it?
He was a client king, that's the term. He was allowed to rule the Iceni on behalf of Rome, maintaining autonomy only as long as he was useful and compliant. His marriage to Boudica was likely a political necessity, strengthening alliances necessary to manage this constant Roman pressure. This relationship ironically made Boudica more visible and more aware of the conditional nature of power.
And motherhood, our sources suggest, sharpened her understanding of the threat, particularly when it came to inheritance laws.
Yes. Prasutagus attempted a classic maneuver to save his tribe from absorption. He designated the Roman emperor and his own daughters as co-heirs in his will. He hoped this would satisfy Rome while preserving the Iceni line of authority. A compromise.
But the Romans violated this custom completely.
They did. According to Roman law, a client kingdom's wealth automatically reverted to the empire upon the client king's death. They ignored his will. They treated the Iceni as conquered territory rather than an ally, seized the family's assets, and crucially, brutalized Boudica and her daughters.
This wasn't just a legal disagreement, it was a fundamental public insult.
It was designed to dismantle the entire Icenian political and social structure. It was a message.
That violation of tribal custom, particularly relating to female inheritance and authority, created the ultimate fault line.
Boudica's upbringing taught her that authority came from safeguarding what sustained the people, the living wealth, the memory, the traditions, and the future of her children. Rome, by reducing that living wealth to numbers on a ledger, ignoring the tribal laws regarding women, and enacting public humiliation, created the casus belli. She recognized the exact moment when political compromise turned into the complete erosion of her sovereignty and her identity.
Her rebellion, therefore, was not a sudden, irrational outburst of rage, but a strategically rooted response. Defense of culture, identity, and the tradition of enduring strength she'd been trained in since childhood.
Exactly. She was prepared for leadership not by being a half-assimilated Roman subject, but by being a proud Icenian woman steeped in the tradition of endurance and the power of memory. That upbringing made her subsequent actions and the scale of the destruction she wrought tragically inevitable.
We've taken a deep dive into three remarkably different cultural confrontations: the Vikings against the land and the Sami, the rigid shogunate against the necessity of night logistics in Edo, and the Iceni against the monolithic power of Rome. Let's bring these concepts together now. Hashtag tag outro.
If we connect this all to the bigger picture, the enduring lesson across the Sami, Edo, and Iceni resistance is the quiet, decentralized power of knowledge and local adaptability when facing overwhelming centralized force. This is the synthesis of our source material.
Right. The Vikings, who were masters of centralized, organized violence, failed against the Sami because their brute force was strategically inefficient. They were defeated not by superior arms, but by superior knowledge of terrain and an enemy who just refused to follow the rules of engagement.
The land and the local people who understood it rejected the invasion.
Then you have the citizens of Edo, living under the intense centralized bureaucracy of the shogunate and this constant threat of fire. They survived not by defying the strict laws, but by constantly bending around them using superior decentralized logistics.
The hyper-efficiency required to feed 1 million people was achieved through small, mobile, carefully managed charcoal stalls that minimized risk while maximizing satisfaction. The local knowledge of those yatai vendors allowed the city to thrive without ever challenging the central authority. It was a perfect, silent symbiosis.
And finally, Boudica. Facing the ultimate centralizing force of Rome, she found the strength for rebellion not in Roman tactics or organization, but in the deep-rooted cultural identity she inherited. She defended her people using the Icenian lessons of endurance, visible strength, and the defense of living wealth against an empire that only understood abstract numbers and conditional power.
In every single case, the dominant power failed when their established tools, Viking armor, Roman law, Edo's fire codes, stopped working against the quiet power of local specificity. You cannot dominate a place or a people that refuses to support you or refuses to stay still long enough to be conquered.
That is a truly powerful synthesis of efficiency, identity, and geography.
So, consider this, listener. The Vikings realized their effort was wasted, not because the Sami were militarily superior, but because they refused to be controlled or pinned down. So when you apply this to your own life or your field of study, what is your unconquerable land? That area where your established, loud, centralized tools or strategies simply stop working.
Where brute force just isn't the answer.
Exactly. Where is the boundary where quiet knowledge, a refusal to conform, and superior local logistics hold the true power, and where your loudest efforts only result in exhaustion and wasted time? That's the frontier worth exploring next.